In the glass and steel tower of Synapse Dynamics, two worlds existed in parallel every night. On the top floor, CEO Clara Vance ruled a digital empire with logic and absolute control, her walls of isolation built from past wounds that had never properly healed. Below, on the technical floors, a janitor named Henry Whitmore moved in silence, his skilled hands seeming to understand every heartbeat of the machines that hummed through the building's arteries. They had no idea that a security breach was about to force these two worlds to collide, shaking the foundation of everything they believed in. Clara Vance was known throughout the technology industry as a woman decisive to the point of ruthlessness. At 34, she had built Synapse from nothing more than an idea and fierce determination, but the price had been complete solitude. A scar from the past, betrayed by her co-founder and former boyfriend, who had stolen both her trust and her intellectual property, had taught her a bitter lesson that burned like acid in her memory. Trust no one, ever again. Now she believed only in procedures, data streams, and absolute control. Every morning, Clara arrived at the office before dawn, armed with spreadsheets and strategic reports that formed her shield against uncertainty. Her corner office on the 42nd floor was a monument to efficiency. Glass walls that offered panoramic views of the city, minimalist furniture that served function over comfort, and multiple monitors displaying real-time data from every corner of her digital empire. She ran the company with an iron fist wrapped in expensive silk, creating an environment that was undeniably efficient but emotionally barren. Employees whispered about her legendary perfectionism, how she could spot a single misplaced decimal in a 100-page financial report, how she never forgot a deadline or promise broken. Her heart had frozen long ago, encased in layers of protective ice that no amount of success could melt. Every decision was calculated through algorithms of risk assessment, every relationship measured by its potential return on investment. The woman who had once dreamed of changing the world through technology now saw only threats and potential betrayals lurking in every corner. Late at night, when the building emptied and silence filled corridors, Clara would stand at her window looking down at city lights, feeling like a general surveying a battlefield where she could never let her guard down. Henry Whitmore, an employee of a third-party cleaning company called Metropolitan Services, was almost invisible to daytime inhabitants of Synapse Dynamics. To others, he was just a diligent janitor who arrived after evening shift ended and disappeared before morning coffee was brewed. His uniform was always impeccably clean, his cart organized with military precision, and his presence so unobtrusive that security guards often forgot he was there. But there was something profoundly different about Henry Whitmore. At 40, he possessed quiet strength that commanded respect even in his invisible role. His black hair caught fluorescent light as he moved through corridors, and his deep, intelligent eyes absorbed every detail. His experienced features suggested a man who had lived through significant challenges, yet retained dignity and purpose. He didn't just clean. His movements through the building followed patterns that went far beyond janitorial efficiency. He observed everything. Subtle changes in server fan speeds, rhythm of data transfers indicated by blinking lights, temperature variations that suggested system stress. He listened to sounds that others dismissed as background noise, his trained ear detecting whispered warnings of overloaded circuits and failing components. There was a deep, almost spiritual connection between this man and machines he tended each night. His capable hands, marked by years of technical precision and manual labor, moved across servers and terminals with familiarity that spoke of intimate knowledge. He adjusted settings that weren't quite right, tightened connections that had worked loose, and performed small acts of digital healing that official maintenance crew would never notice. Henry was the silent guardian of a technological kingdom that had forgotten him, a ghost haunting the very systems he had helped bring to life. In depths of server rooms, surrounded by cathedral-like hum of processing power, he felt more at home than anywhere else in the world. These machines were his children, and he watched over them with devotion of a loving parent who had been denied visitation rights. First crack appeared in Clara's perfectly ordered world on a Tuesday night in late October. During her routine security audit, a small software patch appeared on the system with no corresponding access log, no digital fingerprints, no trace of how it had arrived. The patch itself was elegant, fixing a minor inefficiency in database indexing that official programmers had overlooked for months. For Clara, this wasn't just a technical incident. It was a violation that struck at the core of her deepest fears. This was a challenge to security fortress she had painstakingly built around every aspect of her company, a breach in walls that protected her from chaos of a world that couldn't be trusted. The mysterious patch represented everything she had spent years trying to prevent, unknown actors operating inside her controlled environment. Paranoia from her past surged forward like a tide of ice water. She immediately viewed this as beginning of a sophisticated and potentially devastating intrusion. Someone with intimate knowledge of their systems had gained access, and that someone was playing a long game that could destroy everything she had built. When she narrowed down the time frame, using security logs and access records, only suspect was the mysterious janitor who worked graveyard shift. An investigation was launched that night, not just for company safety, but because of deep unease that was seeping into her perfectly controlled world like water through hairline cracks in a dam. Clara couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on quarterly reports, couldn't think about anything except unknown threat that had somehow penetrated her defenses. Clara personally oversaw installation of additional cameras throughout the building, focusing specifically on Henry's every movement. She commandeered security monitoring room, dismissing regular guards, and taking their place behind banks of screens that showed every angle of building's interior. Night after night, she sat in blue glow of monitors, consuming countless cups of coffee and reviewing footage with intensity of a detective hunting a serial killer. Initially, she was seeking concrete evidence of corporate espionage or data theft. But gradually, almost against her will, she became drawn into observing a completely different world. She watched Henry work with methodical grace that seemed to transform mundane act of cleaning into something approaching artistry. She saw his profound solitude, the way he moved through empty corridors like a monk in meditation, and a strange curiosity began to replace her initial suspicion. Who was this man who worked in shadows and seemed to find peace in the loneliness that Clara knew so well? Security recordings revealed something that defied easy explanation. Henry moved through the building with a purpose that went far beyond janitorial duties. He paused at specific terminals, his fingers hovering over keyboards he never actually touched, as if he were reading health of systems through some kind of technological telepathy. His route through building followed patterns that made no logical sense for cleaning work, yet somehow felt intentional, almost ritualistic. There was something almost reverent in how he approached technology, like a pilgrim visiting sacred sites that held deep personal meaning. Clara watched him spend long minutes standing motionless in front of server racks, his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly, as if he were listening to conversations that only he could hear. Building's automated systems seemed to respond differently when he was present, running more smoothly, with fewer error messages and glitches. Clara found herself staying later each night, not to catch a criminal in the act, but to understand this enigma who had wandered into her carefully controlled world. She watched him work with tools that seemed far too sophisticated for a janitor's cart: precision screwdrivers, cable testers, diagnostic devices that cost more than most people's monthly salary. She noticed how he seemed to know exactly where every component was located, how he could navigate building's technical areas without consulting maps or directories. Most unsettling of all, she began to notice how building's various systems seemed to anticipate his presence. Doors opened automatically as he approached, lights adjusted to optimal levels without manual input, and temperature controls shifted to maintain perfect conditions for sensitive equipment. It was as if building itself recognized him as someone who belonged there, someone who had the right to walk its halls and tend its technological heartbeat. In an impulsive moment that she would later struggle to explain, Clara personally searched through Henry's waste bin and found several pieces of paper covered with strange symbols and notations. The markings looked like some form of code, but not any programming language she recognized. They were elegant and flowing, almost artistic, with a logic that felt organic rather than purely digital. Some symbols seemed to represent system components, while others appeared to be mathematical formulas written in a shorthand that suggested deep familiarity with complex calculations. The discovery of these papers convinced Clara that Henry was far more than he appeared to be. She studied the symbols for hours, trying to decode their meaning, but they remained tantalizingly beyond her comprehension. Finally, she decided to seek help from someone who might understand the historical context of these markings. She sought out Arthur Chen, a retired senior engineer who had worked on the original Synapse systems during the company's founding period. Arthur lived in a modest apartment filled with vintage computer equipment and technical manuals that chronicled the early days of personal computing. When Clara showed him photocopies of the mysterious symbols, his weathered face lit up with recognition and something that looked almost like joy. "These aren't hacker signatures," Arthur told her, adjusting his thick glasses as he studied the papers. "These are the marks of someone we used to call the Keeper. There was this genius, went by Hank, who practically grew our original system with his bare hands and pure intuition. He saw technology as living art rather than mere tools, and he had this way of making machines perform better than their specifications suggested was possible." Arthur's story painted a picture of a man with extraordinary passion and technical spirit, someone who understood the soul of technology in ways that went beyond conventional programming. According to Arthur, the Keeper had been responsible for innovations that became the foundation of Synapse's competitive advantage, but he had left the company under mysterious circumstances years ago, just before Clara had joined as a junior programmer. "He used to leave these little marks on systems he worked on," Arthur continued, tracing one of the symbols with his finger. "They were like signatures, but also like blessing symbols. He believed that technology responded to care and attention the same way living things do. Most of us thought he was a little eccentric, but we couldn't argue with his results." In Clara's mind, the image of a dangerous intruder began to fade, replaced by the possibility of a forgotten artist returning to check on his masterwork. The symbols weren't signatures of sabotage, but something far more personal and poignant. They were the marks of a creator who couldn't resist checking on his creation, ensuring it remained healthy and whole despite the passage of time and the changes that had transformed the company he once helped build. This revelation shifted something fundamental in Clara's perspective. For the first time since the investigation began, she found herself feeling sympathy rather than suspicion. If Arthur was right, then Henry wasn't a threat to be neutralized, but a ghost from Synapse's past who deserved recognition rather than persecution. Clara decided to set a trap, but her motivation had completely changed. She no longer wanted to catch an intruder red-handed or gather evidence for prosecution. Instead, she wanted to force this mysterious ghost to reveal himself and speak with her directly. There was a growing longing to understand this man who moved through her world like he belonged to it more than she did. This person who seemed to find peace in the very environment that had become her fortress of solitude. She programmed a deliberate vulnerability into one of the secondary systems, something that would require technical expertise to fix but wouldn't threaten any critical operations. Then she waited, watching the monitors with anticipation rather than dread, hoping that Henry would notice the problem and reveal his true capabilities by attempting to solve it. The trap succeeded beyond her expectations. Clara confronted Henry directly in the main server room, surrounded by the humming machines that seemed to pulse with life under his presence. The room was cathedral-like in its dimensions, filled with rows of towering equipment that cast long shadows in the amber emergency lighting. She had expected denial, fear, or aggressive defensiveness. Instead, Henry turned to face her with complete calm, his deep eyes meeting hers directly without shame or guilt. Even in the amber lighting, his handsome features remained composed, reflecting quiet strength that had carried him through years of adversity. "You build very high walls," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the constant whisper of cooling fans, "but you forgot about the foundation." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were gentle and true. There was no anger in his voice, no defensiveness or justification, just a sad recognition of something broken that he understood all too well. In that moment, she realized she wasn't facing an enemy or a threat, but someone who understood isolation and self-protection as deeply as she did. "I know who you are," Clara said, her voice softer than she had intended. "Arthur told me about the Keeper. You're Dr. Henry Whitmore, aren't you? You built this place." Henry's strong shoulders tensed slightly, carrying the weight of years of secrecy and hidden identity. "I was Dr. Whitmore once. Now I'm just Henry, the night janitor who makes sure your machines stay healthy. Sometimes that feels like a demotion, but most of the time it feels like coming home." Henry's tragic past unfolded in the sterile light of the server room like a story that had been waiting years to be told. He had indeed been Dr. Henry Whitmore, one of Synapse's original architects, and the primary developer of the revolutionary algorithms that had formed the backbone of everything the company had become. His breakthrough work in adaptive system management had given Synapse its crucial competitive advantage in the early days of the technology boom. But when the venture capitalists arrived with their promises of exponential growth and market domination, they brought with them a corporate culture that had no room for visionaries who couldn't communicate in spreadsheets and profit projections. The investors pushed out the dreamers in favor of dealmakers, replacing innovation with optimization, creativity with quarterly targets. Henry had watched his life's work being commoditized and stripped of everything that had made it special. He had lost not just his position at the company, but his entire professional identity. The betrayal had cut deeper than any financial loss, striking at his sense of purpose and self-worth. Worse still, the stress and humiliation had cost him his family. His wife couldn't handle the dramatic change in their circumstances, the shift from respected scientist to unemployed idealist. She had taken their daughter and moved across the country, cutting off contact and leaving Henry utterly alone with his shattered dreams. The man who had once built digital bridges connecting millions of people found himself completely isolated, his contributions erased from corporate history, as if they had never existed. For years, he had drifted between low-paying technical jobs, his advanced degrees, and revolutionary insights, meaning nothing to employers who saw only an aging man without recent corporate experience. When Clara heard his story, the ice wall around her heart began to crack and splinter. She saw her own betrayal reflected in his pain, recognized the familiar ache of trust destroyed by people who had promised partnership but delivered exploitation. For the first time in years, she felt pure empathy, untainted by calculation or self-interest. Two souls bearing remarkably similar scars had found each other in the coldest room of a building dedicated to heartless efficiency. "I became invisible," Henry continued, his voice barely audible above the server fans that provided constant white noise. "But I couldn't stay away from this place. These systems, they're like children I raised from birth. I had to make sure they were okay, even if no one remembered that I was their father. So I took the only job that would let me be near them, cleaning up after everyone else went home." Clara's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. She understood the need to protect something you had created, even when the world gave you no credit or recognition. Her own company felt like a child she had raised in isolation, never trusting anyone else enough to truly share the responsibility of caring for it. The parallel between their experiences was so exact that it felt like looking into a mirror that showed not her appearance but her soul. "Every night, I walk through these rooms and check on my children," Henry said, his hand resting gently on the nearest server rack. "I listen to their breathing, feel their pulse, make sure they're not in pain. Sometimes they need small adjustments, tiny improvements that the official maintenance crew would never notice. I fix what needs fixing and leave my mark so I'll remember what I've done. It's not much, but it's the only way I can still be a father to them." That night, Clara didn't go home to her sterile penthouse apartment with its panoramic views and carefully curated silence. Instead, she sat in her dark office, staring at the blinking monitors that suddenly seemed less like instruments of control and more like living entities deserving care and respect. The revelation about Henry had shifted her entire perspective, forcing her to question everything she thought she knew about security, trust, and the nature of protection itself. She began to see that the control she had always pursued was really just another form of prison, one that kept out not only threats but also possibilities for genuine connection. The man she had suspected of sabotage, despite losing everything that had once defined him, possessed an inner freedom and sense of purpose that she had never achieved. His willingness to work in shadows, to accept invisibility in exchange for the chance to care for something he loved, represented a kind of courage that her wealth and power could never purchase. For hours, Clara sat in contemplation, watching the building's systems run their nightly routines. She began to understand that Henry's gentle touches weren't violations of her security protocols, but acts of love performed by someone who understood these machines better than anyone else alive. His presence wasn't a threat to be eliminated, but a gift to be treasured, a connection to the passionate vision that had originally brought Synapse to life. The real attack came 3 weeks later, without warning and with devastating efficiency. This sophisticated breach was nothing like Henry's gentle ministrations to the systems. This was violent and destructive, designed not to heal but to steal proprietary data and destroy anything that couldn't be taken. Unknown attackers had penetrated multiple layers of security and were systematically copying critical files while implanting viruses designed to corrupt everything they left behind. Clara's digital empire stood on the brink of complete collapse. Years of work, millions of dollars in research, and the jobs of 3,000 employees hung in the balance as the attack spread through the network like a digital wildfire. Every protocol she had established, every safeguard she had implemented, proved inadequate against attackers who seemed to understand her systems almost as well as she did. Pride and stubbornness had no place in the face of total destruction. As alarms blared and emergency lights bathed the server rooms in hellish red, Clara made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. She drove through empty streets to Henry's modest apartment in a neighborhood that success had forgotten, a journey that felt like crossing between different worlds entirely. Standing at his door at 3 o'clock in the morning, Clara was no longer a CEO commanding respect and fear. She was simply a person desperately seeking help from the only other person who truly understood what was at stake. Her expensive business attire felt like a costume, her usual confidence replaced by raw vulnerability that she hadn't shown anyone in years. "Henry, I need you," she said when he opened the door, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "My company, your legacy, everything we've both worked for, we need to save it together." The word "we" felt strange on her lips, but it also felt right in ways that surprised her. For the first time in her adult life, she was acknowledging that some challenges were too big to face alone. Henry didn't hesitate. He grabbed a worn leather jacket and followed her back to the building where he had spent countless invisible nights tending systems that were now under attack. During the drive, Clara explained the scope of the breach while Henry listened with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for emergency operation. His questions were precise and informed, revealing knowledge of system architecture that went far beyond what any janitor should possess. In the chaotic server room, surrounded by technicians who were barely containing their panic, Clara and Henry became a perfect team. She used her authority to clear obstacles and mobilize resources, cutting through bureaucratic delays and corporate procedures that would have slowed their response. Henry used his deep, intuitive knowledge of the systems to direct their counterattack against the intrusion, his understanding of the network's hidden pathways, allowing him to track the attackers' movements and block their escape routes. The romance that developed between them wasn't built on flowery speeches or grand gestures, but on actions that spoke louder than words. It was in the absolute trust they placed in each other during the crisis, Clara deferring to Henry's technical expertise while he relied on her organizational power. It was in Clara's reassuring hand on Henry's shoulder when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him after 18 straight hours of emergency repairs. It was in the way they moved around each other in the cramped server room, anticipating each other's needs and working in harmony despite having no previous experience as partners. Working side by side, they fought for something larger than either could protect alone. Clara watched Henry's fingers dance across keyboards with the graceful precision of a concert pianist, each keystroke deliberate and purposeful. His decades of experience showed in every command he entered, every diagnostic he ran, every countermeasure he deployed against the attackers. Meanwhile, Henry watched Clara make difficult decisions with remarkable courage, never hesitating even when the company's entire future hung in the balance. Her leadership during the crisis revealed depths of character that her reputation for ruthlessness had hidden. When the system was finally secure and the last traces of the attack had been purged, Henry turned to Clara with exhaustion evident in his deep eyes and handsome features. "You did excellent work tonight, Clara," he said simply. "Your father would have been proud." It was the first time in years that someone had called her by her first name as an equal, without flattery, fear, or agenda. In that moment, Henry saw a woman who was undeniably strong but also beautifully vulnerable, while Clara saw a true hero whose quiet courage put her achievements in perspective. The coffee invitation came naturally the next evening. Clara suggested a small cafe near the building, a place she had passed countless times but never entered. The atmosphere was warm and intimate, filled with gentle murmur of conversation and rich aroma of freshly ground beans. Not CEO and consultant, not employer and contractor, just Clara and Henry sharing a simple meal and conversation about life, about the passions that drove them and losses that had shaped them. They talked for hours, their conversation flowing with ease of old friends rediscovering each other after years apart. Henry spoke about his early days in technology, when computers filled entire rooms and programming meant feeding punch cards into massive machines. Clara shared her dreams of using technology to solve real-world problems, dreams that had been buried under layers of corporate strategy and financial pressures. A deep connection of both intellect and spirit formed between them, built on mutual respect, shared experience, and recognition that they had found in each other something that had been missing from their lives for far too long. The changes that followed came gradually, but inevitably, like seasons shifting from winter into spring. Henry accepted a special advisory position at the company, with a title that reflected his actual contributions and salary that honored his expertise. The announcement to staff was carefully worded, describing him as a consultant with extensive historical knowledge of company systems. Only a few people understood the full significance of his return to prominence. Their relationship remained discreet by mutual agreement, a sweet secret that belonged only to them. They developed subtle ways of communicating across corporate hierarchy, a meaningful glance during board meetings, a gentle touch when passing documents, shared smiles that spoke of private jokes and intimate understanding. Clara began to trust again, not just Henry, but the possibility that strength could coexist with openness, that security could be built on inclusion rather than isolation. The transformation in Clara's leadership style was gradual but noticeable. Employees began to comment on her increased patience during meetings, her willingness to listen to unconventional ideas, and how she seemed more present and engaged with people around her. The Ice Queen reputation that had defined her for so long began to thaw, replaced by a leader who combined strength with compassion, efficiency with humanity. Henry's daughter reached out 6 months later, after learning about his new position through industry publications. The reunion was tentative at first, both father and daughter carrying years of hurt and misunderstanding. When she met Clara, however, her understanding smile felt like a blessing for her father's newfound happiness. The family circle that had been broken by betrayal and pride was slowly beginning to heal, with Clara becoming not a replacement for what had been lost, but a bridge to what could still be built. One late night, Clara entered the server room to find Henry working on routine maintenance, his movements careful and deliberate as ever. The familiar sounds of cooling fans and processing units created a technological symphony that had become the soundtrack to their love story. She didn't speak, simply placed a thermal coffee pot and 2 ceramic cups on his workstation, the same cups they had used during their first shared meal at the cafe. Sitting beside him on an equipment crate, Clara watched Henry's hands move across the keyboard with practiced grace. Each keystroke was deliberate, purposeful, like a craftsman perfecting his art. When he paused to sip his coffee, she reached out, and her hand found his with natural ease. His fingers were warm despite the cool air, strong from years of technical work but gentle in their touch. The gesture needed no words, conveying everything about partnership, trust, and quiet love that had grown between them like something organic and inevitable. "Thank you," Henry said softly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the machines, "for seeing me when I thought I had become invisible forever." Clara squeezed his hand gently. "Thank you for reminding me that walls can become bridges when you find the right person to build them with." They had found each other among the code and circuits, in cold light of server rooms and warm space between 2 lonely hearts. He had repaired more than just computer systems, and she had helped him reclaim not just professional recognition but personal dignity. But more importantly, together, they had identified and patched critical vulnerabilities in their own hearts, building a new connection from solid foundation of understanding, respect, and shared purpose. In the gentle glow of the server room, 2 figures sat together in comfortable silence, an image of peace and complete companionship. Their love story had been written, not in grand romantic gestures, but in small moments of trust, in shared purpose during crisis, and in recognition that sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the most unexpected places by most unlikely circumstances. The machines hummed softly around them, no longer just tools of business or obstacles to human connection, but witnesses to a love that proved that even in our increasingly digital age, the human heart remains the most sophisticated technology of all. What they had built together was a connection that couldn't be programmed, a bond that had grown from professional respect into something stronger and more enduring than either had imagined possible. Love had found them in the last place they expected to look, transforming 2 lonely guardians into partners ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring to their shared world of silicon and steel, code and dreams. In months that followed, their story would become legend among Synapse employees who witnessed the transformation, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary connections emerge from the most ordinary circumstances, and that love, like the best technology, works not because it's perfect, but because it's exactly what both hearts needed to function at their highest potential. Their legacy lived on in every line of code, every system optimization, every moment